Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kate O'Regan. I'm the director of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights, and we're really delighted this afternoon to be welcoming Jane Connors, who is the victims' rights advocate for victim exploitation and abuse by United Nations personnel at the UN, and she's held that position since September 2017. But for those of you who are law students, Jane has had an extraordinary career. She has law degrees, including a Master of Laws degrees from the Australian National University. She's worked as a scholar or an academic at universities. She's worked in the NGO sector for Amnesty International, and she's also worked in international organizations, including the United Nations. So when it gets to Q&A, if you want to ask her some questions about her career and thinking about careers in international organizations, I'm sure she'd be delighted to answer. But first, she's going to tell us about this novel role in international law that she is performing and what she thinks, I imagine, are both its promise and its pitfalls. Jane, a very warm welcome to our webinar.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to see you. And as I say, we met before many years ago, and it's great to see you again. And thank you to your colleagues, Christos and Gareth, for helping me with, I'm not exactly the sharpest tool in the box with regard to technical stuff, but strangely enough, it tends to work if you believe it will. I'm very grateful that participants have taken the time to be with us today. And I just want to say that I hope all of you and all of your families are safe and well during this extremely difficult time. I wish I'd been able to be with you in some form of physical form, but I think we're doing quite well with, I suppose, this remote stuff. I'm very pleased to provide, it's not going to be very deep. I'm not a person who deals really usually in this way with, I suppose, a theoretical framework. I'm just going to talk about the role of the Victims' Rights Advocates mandate and my work. And of course, I'll touch on the challenges I face as the first incumbent of this position. And I don't think it's very often that you will speak to the first incumbent of a position within the United Nations. So you can ask me lots of questions. I'm not a person who uses PowerPoint, so I will just tell you what I intend to do during this period that I'll talk to you. And I'm really keen that we have a lot of opportunity to talk to each other rather than you just listening to me. I'm going to provide background information on sexual exploitation and abuse by United Nations personnel. Then I'll talk about the work of the Victims' Rights Advocate, my office, and the senior victims' rights officers we have in the field. We have 4 in the field since we became operational in late 2017. And then I'll reflect on the challenges that I face, including now with COVID-19, because essentially the roles are operational, and it's very difficult to be operational if you can't go on the ground. And I'll reflect perhaps on how the United Nations system is seeking to meet these challenges. I've given you some documents, or Jacqueline, who works with me, who volunteers with me, has been kind enough to send some documents. You might want to look at them if you're interested, you might not. So let me start with the background, quite simply. And I always start with this. We have about 100,000 staff members in the 35 entities which make up the United Nations system. We have many non-staff personnel, including uniformed military and police personnel, contractors and implementing partners. And the uniformed personnel make up also about 100,000. And it's difficult to count how many contractors and implementing partners we have. Most of these people, the vast majority, performs their work with integrity, complies with the United Nations standards, and their service has brought peace, development, and enjoyment of human rights to many contexts. So we can talk of the achievements, but then we have some difficulties. They often work in very difficult and sometimes extremely dangerous situations. Many have been killed, kidnapped, or injured on the job. Indeed, last week I participated in the ceremony honouring the 77 personnel from 41 countries killed between the 16th of March and the 31st of December last year. So we've got to look at the large numbers, the difficulties they face, and now we're getting to the not so good part. Unfortunately, we've got a situation, and one just cropped up recently, and many of you probably have seen it. It was covered in the New Humanitarian. Many of these activities, our activities, have been undermined by allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeeping, humanitarian and development personnel. Most of you probably think about the peacekeeping personnel because that's where there's been most focus. This is extremely shameful because their victims are the women, men and children that they are supposed to protect and assist. Similar allegations have cropped up also, implicating people working in charities and other organizations delivering humanitarian and development aid, including as our partners, United Nations partners. The wrongs, of course, cause harm. They cause suffering to victims. They often leave them with children, and some of you may have come across literature on peace babies. I don't like the term at all, but academics seem to like it. Well, not only academics, but people like that sort of language. The acts, of course, have profound negative impact on communities in the short and long term. They normalize the behavior and suggest they're permissible, and often they leave an economy of sexual exploitation behind. They also fracture trust amongst populations, undermining the United Nations legitimacy, compromising and sometimes frustrating the essential work we perform. So this is the reality, but for over 20 years, the United Nations entities have sought to respond firmly to allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse. And starting with Kofi Annan, successive secretaries general have implemented what is described as a zero tolerance policy. And they've put in place prevention and response measures, policy, various, training, etc., in order to address these. These have often followed independent reviews into particularly nasty scandals. One was conducted by Prince Zayed in the early 2000s. And then in 2016, many of you will be aware of a panel report into some horrible allegations relating to the Central African Republic, which became apparent in 2014. It must be said that most of these allegations didn't, in fact, implicate United Nations personnel, but rather soldiers who were serving under the UN flag who were contributed by a state and mandated by a Security Council mandate. Overarching policies are set out in the 6 core principles of the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the coordination mechanism for UN and non-UN partners providing humanitarian assistance, and more significantly, in the 2003 Bulletin on Special Measures for Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse, which was issued by the Secretary General, which was issued by Kofi Annan, in fact. And this bulletin, and I've given you a copy of it, it's very thin and it's worthwhile reading to a certain extent. The terms of that bulletin are reflected in the rules of all United Nations system entities, and the revised model memorandum of understanding for military contingents and formed police units, concluding with countries which contribute those personnel. So, as I say, worthwhile looking at and quite interesting. I'll just give you the definitions because it's important to know what we're talking about. Sexual exploitation is defined as any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power or trust for sexual purposes, including but not limited to profiting monetarily, socially or politically from the sexual exploitation of another. And sexual abuse is the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or unequal or coercive conditions. And they're interesting definitions. I do a lot of work on what happens at the national level with respect to sexual offences. And those definitions are a bit wider than some that you might come across in national level systems. This bulletin also prohibits any sexual activity with a child who is a person under the age of 18, and that's irrespective of the local age of majority, the consent of that child, or the mistaken belief of the perpetrator. It similarly prohibits any exchange of money, employment, goods, or services for sex. In other words, any transactional sex is prohibited, and describes sexual relationships between United Nations staff and beneficiaries of assistance as being based on inherently unequal power dynamics, which undermine the credibility and integrity of the work of the United Nations, and they are therefore strongly discouraged. I would like to see them prohibited, but there's a long discussion about this, and we can discuss that later. The bulletin describes these acts, which I've set out, as serious misconduct, constituting grounds for administrative and disciplinary measures. And where allegations are substantiated, this means dismissal for United Nations staff and repatriation for uniformed personnel. And now the names of the individuals concerned, as well as those who left for any reason during an investigation, are included in an electronic tool called ClearCheck, which is a UN system-wide database, the idea of which is to stop the revolving door, to stop any re-employment in another part of the United Nations and/or mission service. Now, we've got those standards, we've got many preventative and response measures, but we continue to receive allegations, and they're reported in real time on the United Nations website, and it's worthwhile looking at that. You'll see it reported in terms of mission personnel, uniformed and civilian, civilian personnel in humanitarian and development contexts, and also our implementing partners. Others, those are the ones that are reported and reach us. Others surface in the media and through academic research. And what we encourage is that those who are surfacing these allegations ask those people who are bringing them forward to them to bring them to our attention so that we can actually pursue the alleged perpetrators. Coming to now, more or less, coming to our current Secretary General, he takes these issues extremely seriously. And when he took his oath of office in late 2016, he, amongst his other pledges, and there weren't so many, pledged to prioritise prevention and response to sexual exploitation and abuse, undertaking to work very closely with member states on structural and operational measures to make zero tolerance a reality. And he also prioritised victims because he spoke about victims and the need for effective remedies. In the first week of when he was on the job, which was about 3 weeks later, he tasked one of his staff, the special coordinator on prevention of this conduct, to develop what he described as a game-changing strategy. And that strategy is set out in a report he transmitted to the General Assembly in February 2017. And it essentially consists of 4 areas of focus, his 4-pronged strategy. The first is putting the rights and dignity of victims first, and that prong cuts across the other 3. Ending impunity, building a multi-stakeholder approach, and reorienting our communications towards transparency and creating a global platform for sharing best practices. I think the first 2 are easy to understand, putting the rights and dignity of victims first, ending impunity. Building a multi-stakeholder approach, not so easy, but essentially let's all work together and see if we can crack this behaviour. And then with regard to the communications, let's change the narrative, which is very difficult to do because if you work in an organisation such as mine, it really hurts you that this conduct occurs, and there is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to try to not minimise it, but somehow say that this is a few bad apples rather than something that might be structural and that you need to get at the root of. So to be a little less defensive than we might have been in the past and to work with others to bring together best practices. Now, the part that I'm going to talk about is the rights and dignity of victims first, of course. And that's a radical shift from what has gone before. Earlier strategies essentially focused on the reputation of our organizations. That's not a bad thing, but we don't want to only focus on the reputation of our organizations and on the conduct and discipline of personnel. And a commentator, a very interesting woman, just produced a podcast on her recent book on peacekeeping and sexual exploitation and abuse. She calls that a human resources approach, which doesn't get to the root of why the behavior persists. So again, it looks at how to get rid of that sort of person, not sometimes very successfully, but now we have clear checks, so happily they don't come back. To operationalize this new approach, the shift, he created this role of the victim's rights advocate. And the idea of that role was that person would work across the United Nations system at headquarters and in the field to identify ways to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and if they occur, promote and protect victims' rights to report and receive support, ensure their cases are properly managed, and perpetrators held accountable. Now, one thing to note is that the role is envisaged as system-wide. It is not only applicable to peacekeeping, so it's not only about the blue helmets, but it's applicable to humanitarian and development settings also. It requires a lot of cooperation, and you have to be a very patient person. So you've got to work with states, local authorities, civil society, including and human rights organizations, especially in the field. So victims benefit from the full effect of local laws and remedies. And as I said, we have these field victims' rights advocates who are designated in 4 countries, those countries from which the greatest number of allegations have been received. And they tend to be the countries from which one of them, not so many allegations are being received, but they are Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and South Sudan. And if you look at the web site that I suggest you look at, you'll see that we're still getting allegations from Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan. And it's interesting to see, you will see that the military, the uniformed personnel, where they come from is identified, not for the civilian personnel, because the General Assembly will not allow that. So with Haiti, we don't have new allegations, but there are significant numbers of outstanding paternity and child support cases from earlier days, the MINUSTA days, some time ago. They are the main contact for victims, the field victims' rights advocates, field victims' rights officers. They accompany them as they report. They seek to get them to report. They seek to get them assistance and accountability, and they keep them abreast of their cases. And the Secretary General asked for the appointment of such advocates in other contexts. We've just had our weekly meeting with the field victims' rights advocates in those countries. And well, they're not in those countries at the moment. Some of them they're working virtually with the victims. And all I can say is that this was genius in order to suggesting that there be individuals on the ground who would be championing the rights of victims. As Kate indicated, we started our work in late 2017. That's less than 3 years ago. We started in challenging circumstances. We had entirely new functions. We were required to work on an entirely new concept. We had the usual vague terms of reference written in, what do we call it? Globish, UNEs, Globish, the language of the globe, and limited resources. In fact, as I say, my first task was to argue in the UN's budgetary bodies that the post and my office should be established and resourced. And I've got a funny story. When I arrived, they said, we haven't worked out exactly how we'll pay you. And I thought, you know, if it'd been a person who hadn't been in the UN, that might have made them a bit agitated. Firstly, I just did what I always did. I always do. I spoke to everybody, member states, United Nations entities, intergovernment and regional organizations. I did what a normal UN person does, civil society, academia, explaining the role and what the meaning of a victims-centered approach meant. And this is something we're still working on. And I also worked with the field victims' rights advocates. And as I say, we speak to them all the time. I then conducted my first field visit in October 2017. So just imagine, I start work in the middle of September 2017. October 2017, I get a phone call. The Secretary General wants you to come with him to the Central African Republic, with other people, of course. And he and I met victims. And through that experience, I realized that the most important thing was to give visibility to them, give voice to them, and listen to them, and try to convey to others what they want. Since visiting Central African Republic, I visited 7 other countries with varying United Nations presences. And there I've met with victims individually and confidentially. In some countries, you can't meet with victims because they're so frightened, and the legal systems that exist in those countries makes it very, very dangerous for them to report. But those I meet with complain about the same, they have complaints. So they're not easy meetings, of course, because I'm a UN person and they're victims of UN personnel. So you could imagine they're not going to meet me and be very enthusiastic about meeting me. And they've said to me, we've seen people like you before, nothing changes, everything's the same. But what they complain is of complex, inaccessible or unclear complaint pathways, lack of protection, this is a big thing, they're not protected, limited or no assistance on health, education and livelihoods, concerns for their children, distressing investigative procedures, often marked by repeated interviews, very little support, in fact none, for legal or other redress, especially paternity child support claims, often involving difficulties in accessing documents, laboratory results and information needed to support their claims. For some reason, these are documents that you don't give victims. I don't know why. A common grievance is they receive patchy or no information on the progress of their cases. And any of you who've done any work on domestic sexual assault and so on will know that they're common complaints of victims of sexual assault. What I've done for you, and you can have a look at it, it's very pretty. I've provided my 2019 informal report, which gives an idea of my work. What I did over the last couple of years is map services available in 13 countries, which are available to victims. I've developed a statement on victims' rights. The idea of that is to make individuals and communities aware of the behaviour they should expect from United Nations personnel and those who help us deliver our programs, and what their rights actually are. It's framed in rights rather than help assistance type language. And I've also developed a companion document for United Nations staff. These are internal at the moment. It's very, very difficult to come up with something which is system-wide across the UN. And there are lots of issues that affect development of such a thing. The report also speaks about what the field victims' rights advocates have done, including with regard to paternity child support claims, setting up bank accounts to receive maintenance payments, supporting victims to give testimony in courts martial, assisting community-based mechanisms, implement preventive mechanisms, receive and channel complaints, and develop and implement livelihood projects which support victims rebuild their lives. That's what we've done, but we've got real challenges, and I think the challenges might outweigh our achievements. On assistance, the mapping I referred to, and there are summaries of the results for each country on our webpage, shows that services for victims are generally rolled into existing programming for victims of gender-based violence. These services are variable in availability and quality, and in certain contexts they're not available at all, and where you would really need it, which subject to conflict and so on, you mightn't find services at all. These services rarely address the specific needs of victims of sexual exploitation by United Nations personnel, in particular legal assistance and protection, and don't reflect, to my mind, the higher duty of care we owe such victims. Also, we don't have comprehensive, accurate data on victims. We don't have any system-wide tool to track victims, the assistance they receive, and available resources. And that's difficult because if you're thinking of a place, if you're thinking such as of a continent like Africa, the borders are porous and people move from place to place. We were talking about the victims from DRC that they've moved into Rwanda. That becomes very complicated. Allegations are also often unreported. We had research published last year on children fathered by they didn't know how to do so. They lacked trust, feared stigma, abandonment or reprisals, or received incentives from the perpetrator, their families, the perpetrator's families or communities not to do so, or believed nothing would happen. In some countries, there's grave risks, as I've said. National legal systems may have very negative elements, such as criminalization of the provider of transnational sex, impose penalties for same-sex sexual activity, or impose penalties for adultery, which is broadly defined, in other words, sex outside marriage. It might allow for reparatory marriage, where the thing goes away if the perpetrator marries the victim, or tolerate so-called honor crimes. The acts may not even meet the definition of criminal conduct. Investigations can not necessarily be wonderful. United Nations investigators investigate all forms of misconduct, fraud, theft, petrol, this sort of thing, may not have the training required for sexual exploitation and abuse cases. We know all about unconscious bias, and unconscious bias really affects people where victims are concerned. That may result in unconscious or even conscious disrespect, including subjecting the victim to repeated interviews. Some investigators choose not to proceed where they consider the victim unreliable or where they decide not to participate in the process. They may hold the view that a victim-centered approach means that the victim has a right to veto disciplinary procedures. Investigations conducted for criminal or civil purposes may also have these flaws. And this brings me to justice, accountability, and remedies for victims. And you're there and you're dealing with law. I'm a lawyer, as you heard, qualified. And it's funny, as you go on in life, law is very important, but it isn't the entire answer. And there are elaborate justice, accountability, and remedies procedures set up for victims, but essentially this is elusive. The United Nations is only empowered to impose administrative or disciplinary sanctions on perpetrators where allegations are substantiated. It doesn't have a criminal jurisdiction and cannot provide individual relief to victims. Where criminal accountability is concerned, different legal regimes apply to different categories of personnel, but in general, jurisdiction lies outside the country where the act took place, and the cooperation of the state of jurisdiction is absolutely critical. This also applies to civil cases such as paternity, child support claims. The role of the United Nations is to cooperate. It's a sort of soft word, but cooperate can be pretty tough, with states to achieve accountability. And I'm convinced legal obstacles preventing states pursuing accountability are inflated. It's more a political issue. Personnel are definitely not immune from suit, and extraterritorial jurisdiction for crimes is increasingly available. But the acts involved must be defined as crimes in the state of jurisdiction. That won't be the case with sexual exploitation, usually, unless you've got personnel who come from countries that use the Nordic system. And its legal framework must be victim-oriented, must encourage victims. Obstacles to the pursuit of accountability, as I say, may be political. There is often a weak protective environment for victims. including because of customary, cultural, and stereotypical perspectives. Victims usually don't know their rights, can't afford a lawyer or access legal aid, and few lawyers know how to deal with these cases. Well, they don't see the point, and I think they don't see the point is the saddest thing. And this is where my work kicks in, the victims' rights approach. Our final, well, there are many challenges, but now we're in the midst of COVID-19. And there are two issues here. One is the provision of assistance to victims, including, importantly, that directed to gaining livelihoods, has been affected by physical distancing measures and restrictions on movement, mitigation measures. And resources also with COVID-19, it shifts, everybody's looking at COVID-19, and resources may be pulled away from victims and communities in vulnerable situations as their concerns may not be prioritized. But my colleagues are doing their best. They're totally committed. They meet with victims weekly. They've set up SMS, they've set up training by SMS, reporting by SMS and things of that nature. They speak to the victims via cell phones. They've provided phones, put Zoom on it. I mean, they've done as much as they possibly can. And they're in touch with service providers who are often not locked down as they are, who've continued to work to strengthen complaint mechanisms. But things are very difficult, particularly as COVID-19 affects people in the countries where there are vulnerable populations, because they may be very frightened to come forward. And the final challenge is, and we know this from the Ebola response coming out of COVID-19, as things open up and humanitarians and others move in to help, we often find that there is a spike in cases. This hasn't occurred as yet. This is because vulnerable people become even more vulnerable and often engage in transactional sex to survive. So we find vetting of staff may be less rigorous, restricted access may limit oversight. So that's something we look into as something that may happen in the future, but in the meanwhile, it hasn't occurred. The cases haven't spiked. We're still getting reports from time gone by with regard to sexual exploitation and abuse by our personnel and others, but here we are. So I'm going to stop here. I've given you, please follow us on Twitter, UN_OVRA. That's our Twitter handle, on where you'll find interesting stuff. We offer online internships and United Nations volunteer roles. We don't pay you for that, but please consider them because you can do a lot of interesting things. And finally, as I've said, please consider as you go forward the United Nations as a place that you might want to consider. It's a big organization, 35 affiliated organizations, as I say. It is worthwhile working for a long time. If you're someone like me, or a short period of time, you will not regret it, I don't think. Anyway, I will stop at that point.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. That really was an interesting overview of the role. I wondered if I could start off by saying, or asking you how you feel the fact of immunities for international organization feeds into thinking about the problems of victims.
I think the fact of the immunities, well, the issue is that the immunities protect the United Nations as an organization. So there's no possibility, though I think that probably could be a possibility if you had some imaginative type professionals who worked in this area. So there's no capacity to do anything, for example, with regard to compensation for victims. So we do have a fund, and there are other funds, a fund which sets up project activities in order to assist victims to rebuild their lives. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with regard to immunities, because this activity, whilst it is under the UN flag, it's individual activity, and certainly civilian personnel have no immunity. They will it will be lifted. The Secretary General has made it clear that there will be no immunity for civilian personnel in United Nations organizations for this form of conduct. The complication becomes how, even though you don't have the immunity, do you manage to bring the cases forward if you wish to have a criminal case, or it's not so difficult, of course, with the civil case, but it remains a situation where you need to have a decent legal framework, and you need to have decent legal support, and that's where we're seeking to work. With regard to uniformed personnel, that's in the hands of those who contribute to those uniformed personnel. And what we can do is what we seek to do: energetically cooperate, seek to have the personnel in a position where they know what they're not supposed to do, and keep them under supervision and so on, and have policies and programs in place where they are. And with a command and control, I think you can manage that. And of course, there is this Security Council Resolution 2272, which provides, in a case where there has been a sort of egregious pattern of behaviour with regard to contingents, or there hasn't been the appropriate response, those contingents will be sent back from where they come. It's very, I mean, I think the issue is that we work in a political context, in a diplomatic context, and that's when the law is there, and we have to be much more energetic. And I think we're becoming more energetic, but I think there was more politics than there might have. Well, there will always be politics, but the energy depends on the commitment of the Secretary General and his senior staff. And I don't deal with those sorts of things, though I do to a certain extent, but they have accountability processes which he is really making sure are in place and are operating, or they are not there any longer.
Thank you. Well, I mean, these are, as we know, with the immunities, in some ways, it's a moving target. We have begun to see some shifts in relation, for example, to how people who work within international organizations should be given fair process in order to ensure to protect the immunities. It'll be interesting to see, whether we see shifts elsewhere. But I'd like to turn to one of the questions put by one of our participants, which is, is there a legal framework, and if so, what is it for dealing with reparations of victims?
Well, we haven't dealt with reparations for victims of sexual exploitation and abuse, except insofar, and this is where it becomes a little bit messy, because there are steps being taken with regard to victims of gross human rights violations. A reparations fund has been established by Dr. Mukwege, for example, though not under the UN umbrella. And that becomes confusing as well. So he has established, with Nadia Murad, a reparations fund for victims of sexual violence in conflict. But in terms of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel, I suppose the closest we get to is this very small trust fund in support of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel, which it's only raised a little over $2 million since it was established by the Secretary General, and it essentially creates project-based activities, which can include legal support and livelihood support. So I'm always asked that question, because I think the issue, sort of what is the difference between sexual violence in armed conflict, what is the difference, and then there are sort of semi-reparations funds for victims of sexual violence generally, but the conducts are different, and we haven't sort of aligned them as well as we could. But we have Pablo de Greff on the Civil Society Advisory Board. The Secretary General set up a civil society advisory board to support him in his work with regard to sexual exploitation and abuse. We hope that he may be able to inspire this sort of thing in the mind of the Secretary General.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for that. And that was a question from the Coalición Mujeres de Ecuador, the Women's Coalition Ecuador. Yeah. So very nice to know that they're participating. Turning then to the next question, which I think is a very important question, which is given that a lot of issues around sexual exploitation, particularly by peacekeeping forces, are really around trying to change behavior. Mm-hmm. How much consideration has been given to kind of pre-deployment training in home states for people who are going to be deployed in peacekeeping missions?
It's of course up to the state who provides the personnel to organize the pre-deployment training, but we have a very active conduct and discipline service which works with states who will deploy, who will be deploying personnel, and they have very developed training and so on and so forth, and they do, if of course the member state agrees, and generally the member state does agree, they do support pre-deployment training. I haven't been involved in that training as yet. There's about to be a few new rotations, and yesterday I did suggest that it would be very useful for them not only to hear about how bad sexual exploitation and abuse is, but also to think about the impacts of sexual exploitation and abuse with regard to the communities to which you're being deployed, with regard to the individuals you're going to be working with. So sort of a shift with regard to how you might deal with it. I have seen some very good practices on the ground, and this will depend to a large extent on the leadership. It will depend on the nature of the special representative of the Secretary General and what she or he, it's generally a he, of course, is engaged in, how that person is going to deal with the personnel in the mission. I have seen very, very effective force commanders and police commissioners, and I have seen very, very effective sexual exploitation and abuse focal points within the military, generally women, and within the police forces who put in place in order to make personnel aware of the conduct, aware of the impact of the conduct and how they should conduct themselves. So a lot has changed. I mean, you get to a point. It's interesting with regard to academic commentary, as I know, having been an academic. What you write is published several years later. So this book I spoke about recently with regard to the behaviour of peacekeepers, what was written in 2017, before the Secretary General's new policy came into place, and the steps he put in place with regard to accountability measures with respect to senior personnel is not reflected, nor is the fact that there is a victim-centred approach and a victims' rights advocate and the advocates in the field. So there, I mean, there's a bit of, it's only 3 years. I mean, it's less than 3 years that this, well, it's 3 years the policy's been in place. Many things have occurred, but there's a lot to do. And of course, I have to be upbeat about these things because you can say nothing is being done, or you can say there's a lot more that needs to be done, and a lot more. But everything is reflective, of course, of the nature of play. I mean, the nature of the world. We've got a long way to go with regard to power. An appreciation of what power does, and an appreciation that even the most powerless person has a lot more power over a person who has nothing. So a person who appears to be, you look at the personnel in missions, for example, in humanitarian contexts, the personnel who's driving the car, may look powerless, but to a person who has nothing, and people will say they will do anything to survive.
No, exactly.
Mm.
And the same questioner has an interesting follow-up, which may be on your to-do list, which is the current 2017 UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations pre-deployment training manual has sexual harassment as a category 2 misconduct, with theft and fraud and also speeding, the commentator says. And is that something that your office would have jurisdiction to recommend a change to, or to?
Oh yeah, sexual harassment I don't deal with.
Okay.
But I do deal with victims of sexual harassment because there is no one for them. Sexual harassment is and it's really very distressing because it's all forms of sexual misconduct perpetrated by a staff member on another staff member. So it has a different route, but it is something that certainly I pay attention. I mean, there's only myself in a very tiny office, and I am very keen, and this is why I'm working on this, what is a victims' rights approach? Because you ask people what is a victims' rights approach, and they say, oh, it's an approach that puts the victims at the center. So that's what I've been trying to do, sort of based on, because I've come across, as you know, in South Africa, there is a victims' rights commissioner or something like that. In the United Kingdom, there are several of these victims' rights commissioners. In my country, and based on those codes that the victims' rights code that they have issued, so people know about the rights of victims. So that's what I'm trying to do. But as you can imagine, this can create a few issues. Sort of
there's a lot to be done and not a lot for you to do it, as it were. Exactly.
Yeah, but it can, sort of when you're writing this, the victim has the right, do no harm, these sorts of things. What does that mean, and how do you provide a sort of a document like that which doesn't lift expectations to a level that will be just bring about disappointment? How do you define confidentiality and the consent issues at the same time as making it clear that there is no place in UN organizations for people who engage in this conduct. So the victim cannot be in a position to say that I would prefer that person not to be disciplined.
Yeah. It is. It's a very delicate matter. So just turning to a different issue, and that's one of our questioners asked about the kind of challenges which you mentioned when you were speaking of COVID-19 in terms of actually reaching out to people who have been victims but who are in many ways in remote parts of the world and with relatively little access to digital tools. I mean, have you been thinking about how to make sure that your 4 local field office workers and officers are able to actually reach people, be reached by people in these difficult times?
Well, I think they're doing what they can, and you'd be surprised at not the digital so much, but the fact how many, people all have some form of phone, not necessarily a smartphone. So people are able to be in contact with people. And I was very impressed by my field victims' rights advocate in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He organized, how he acquired that, I don't know. He acquired sort of the smartphones on which he loaded Zoom, on which he loaded whatever he needed to load, WhatsApp and so on and so forth. And he's keeping in touch with the victims he knows about through those means. And of course, we work with community-based complaints mechanisms with community, there are various quality, of course, with those who don't have the same constraints. So they're not under, our personnel are by and large under lockdown. They cannot move around. But those people who implement, who work with the victims directly, they are not necessarily under lockdown, but they are subject to physical distancing, I don't like to call it social distancing, and other mitigation measures. So they still manage to keep in touch with them. But it is not, in other contexts, they would travel to see them, but they can't do that now. And of course, those in the most remote and where the eyes are not, situations are at greater risk, and it's more difficult to reach out to them. But we heard from our colleagues just before I started this webinar that one of the victims had been, she had given birth in a hospital. The baby was, they were being looked after. They've been able to organise transport for them to receive what they need to receive, but of course it's clearly it's going to get, it depends on the trajectory of the virus, and it also depends on the fear, because that is another issue. There is in many of the places where we work, there is a notion that the virus has been introduced by people who come from abroad. So, and those people who come from abroad, people who travelled and so on, they're going to be in missions, for example. And in some of the missions, there's quite a high infection. So that's going to, will they be affected? And then when things open up, they will have greater needs and so on. So we will see what happens. But it's, we're thinking, all we can do is think about the risks, and we can think about what can be done. And but it's really, what you want to do is to be able to go and see people so you can talk to them, and this is not a possibility at the moment.
And then another question is about the records of people who are identified as perpetrators, people who are, as it were, UN officials, so in this case not necessarily members of defence forces who are contributing to peacekeeping efforts, but actual UN officials. To what extent would that be recorded on their their record as an employee of the UN, and to what extent would that information be shared with potentially with future potential employers of such people? Is there any kind of sense that there's accountability for the perpetrators through employment practices?
Well, that's the idea of this clear check that I spoke of. That was introduced for that very reason. Because we have the 35 organisations, and you'll recall from the Oxfam scandal, we had the scenario of, and we had the same. So within those 35 organisations, one would move on, and often when an investigation was ongoing, they may move. So the whole idea of clear check, which was introduced in 2018, and has now been accepted by the majority of the UN entities. If there is a substantiated case of sexual exploitation or abuse, but of course it has to be substantiated. And bear in mind, we've got this. We have a complex disciplinary. There's an investigation and then a disciplinary proceeding. So those who have those substantiated cases and those who leave during an investigation for whatever reason, without the investigation being fulfilled, their names will be found in ClearCheck, and that is available to employers to. If they move to seek to move to another part of the United Nations, that's available for them to look at. With regard to other organisations, there's discussions ongoing as to whether that can be extended to other organisations. There are, of course, sometimes the immunities are not so bad. There are, of course, issues with regard to data protection, which will affect organisations which are not UN organisations. But that was that whole notion. And you're supposed to, if you've ever applied for a UN job or ever applied for anything, on your application, you are asked if you've been involved in X, Y, Z and the other thing. And indeed, you're involved if you asked whether you have had any, whether sexual exploitation and abuse. And of course, if you say no, and it becomes apparent that you didn't exactly tell the truth, that is not going to be very good either.
Yeah.
But it's strange how when faced with that sort of thing, I've had a number of people contact me as they've applied for UN jobs, asking for advice on whether they were involved in this sort of thing, if they were involved in an investigation, even as a witness. So, but I suppose yes. But ClearCheck, I think will have. When it's being used, but as it becomes better used, I think it will have a very good effect. The difficulty, I mean, it is disappointing with regard to international civilians, and they, of course, often the immunities will not be waived because the national context in which they commit their engage in their behaviour will not be the jurisdictional context at the national level will not be ideal. I mean, if you're going to be subject to the death penalty or whatever, that's not necessarily going to be workable. But where there is jurisdiction in the countries of their nationality, we don't. There is an annual report which is worthwhile looking at, which goes to the 6th Committee of the General Assembly, which looks at the criminal responsibility of UN officials and experts on mission. So that it's not that's where I get to my problem with law.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And what I did want to just say to participants is that we have put up on chat links to the documents Jane has been talking about. They also were sent to participants who had registered before we began, so they should be in your email box if you're struggling to find them. Turning to the next question though, I mean, are you seeing a pattern whereby poor levels of or poor access to primary education and potentially sex education is a red flag in relation to targeting of victims, or you see higher levels of kind of sexual exploitation and abuse in circumstances where the local community has had less access to primary education and sexual health education?
I can't answer that. I think the trends we haven't. I mean, there are certain issues that I'd like to look at, but the delegations ask us about what we're seeing with regard to trends and seeing with regard to sort of risk mitigation. There are risk mitigation issues which mainly relate to physical, things like whether you've got little shops outside the compound, things of that nature. If you're looking at uniformed personnel, there's less information about humanitarian and development contexts. But there was a very interesting comment made the other day by one of my colleagues with regard to the context where women and children are seen in the host. I mean, where you have weak judicial. I mean, you have the UN there to assist and support, and then around them weak rule of law, weak judicial systems, legislation, legal provisions which are just ghastly with regard to women and children, and then the very notion that women and children are, I suppose, chattels. I mean, that this remains so that I think affects, but I mean, there's nothing I can say with regard to education, and we see, perpetrators have different levels. So it's, but I think it's the whole issue of inequality, and total vulnerability. I mean, the people are not vulnerable per se, but they're in the situations which are just dreadful. And if you think about how easy it is, and also how people can fool themselves that they have consent. We see, we see it in all, cases all the time, and these areas have many issues that exacerbate those sorts of notions.
Yeah.
But until, I think it would be very useful to have many more women in positions. I'm not saying that women are all wonderful, fabulous, and I won't go into some I've known, but it would be very useful to have a reflection of societies in our leadership, in our peacekeeping personnel. I did have someone say to me, oh, well, they couldn't, women, we'd have to work out a role for them in the mission. And I said, what about force commander? But the most sophisticated people will still say that to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of our questions has wondered up whether we're in a kind of political moment where, as a result of things like the Me Too movement, that might be giving some strength to your office in carrying out its work. The kind of sense, I think, in many countries, although not everywhere, that sexual exploitation and abuse is, utterly unacceptable, and the sense that there's a kind of growing wave of anger about it. Is that influencing you, or is that influencing the way your office works and the way you can work, or does that seem quite remote in the kind of places in which you're mostly working?
I think that's more referable to sexual harassment. Obviously, it informs, it informs the work that we do. But I wrote my first, I'm a very old person, and my master's thesis concerned reporting child abuse. And I wrote that master's thesis in the mid-70s. And then I moved on and I started working on violence against women. And I have seen these moments before, and I'm hoping that the moment is not a moment. I'm hoping that it is a sustained moment. But it does need a lot of support from people. People such as I'm talking to now, those who are in a position where they can really shape opinion, really understand that these things really matter, and that there is an enormous, the whole notion of stereotypical notions of how people behave, alive and kicking. There's just so much work to be done. So with regard to sexual harassment, definitely, I think the Me Too movement really did push the United Nations to create a new policy on sexual harassment, and also pushed the UN to have a system-wide survey on sexual harassment in the organizations of the United Nations. Less is effect probably in my context because of the huge differential and the sort of people that, the sort of needs that we're dealing with, the sort of rights that we need to recognize.
Yeah. And then I think what might be our last question is, it's an interesting sort of self-reflective question for you. For those of us or people who are working in the area of seeking to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, are there things we need to interrogate about our own practices in order to prevent doing harm? And, are there particular areas in which that you think one needs to look at very closely to make sure you don't make things worse?
Don't encourage, I suppose, raising expectations. And that's a big issue. And also making it clear that, this is a difficult thing to say, making it clear that that there is a necessity for those who uh, who are, I mean, not only for those of us who are in, sort of to support, but that it is that we don't infantilize. I suppose that's, I mean, that, and I don't, I mean, I certainly don't have a problem with the word victim, which I don't think is pejorative. And there's a lot of work on the word victim, and many people say that if you call me a survivor, you allied the perpetrator. And then there are those who say, I don't want to be called a victim because it makes me feel weak. But I think, sort of, but take a rights-based approach. I mean, and that is, and just even your language, the assistance, support, we're talking about entitlement, not charity. So those are the sorts of things, and then the underpinning is where we need to go. I thought you were going to ask me, as one person did at another point, do you ever reflect on the fact that you shouldn't be working for the UN if people behave in this way? Which I mean, how do you feel when one of these allegations, and you can, I mean, I just feel terrible when one of these allegations comes forward, and they will come forward, but one hopes they come forward less. But
I think if one's an actor in the world, one can't say I'll only work for organizations which are without sin, because that'll be the end of doing anything.
Yeah, it'll limit you, really. But anywhere where there's, I mean, I've it's been very interesting since I started this job. I've had I mean, various church members, UEFA. I mean, because that pattern of where there's power and inequality and opportunity is a sort of red thread through these organizations, even in my experience in universities, but hopefully that's being attended to now.
Yeah. Well, there was one last question that, in a sense, it was one with another one. I thought I should separate it out for your very final comment, which is, what makes you hopeful about the work that you do, and what do you see as the biggest challenge going forward?
I think the thing that makes me hopeful, well, it's a funny little thing. When I was in Haiti in 2018, I had this collection of women who were, attacking me because their children couldn't go to school. And I said to them, look, I can't do much, but I'm listening to you and I'm going to try to do something. And with some colleagues, we developed a very small project, tiny bit of money, whereby those kids could go to school. And we're trying, sort of looking for money here, there, and whatever. You'd think it would be easy, but it's not. And just the fact that you can make a difference, that small things can make a huge difference. And then, as one of my field victims' rights advocates was talking about this morning, there's not this morning, a little while ago, this morning for the other part of the world, but how, sort of, one of the women has managed to organize her own business and so on. And so, I mean, the resilience of people is remarkable. A little bit of sort of realization of your rights will go a long way. So that, that's makes me hopeful, but it's a little bit too little. If you really need, resources are crucially important. And you can try to stick things together with, sort of sellotape, but it mightn't necessarily work for long enough.
Okay, well, Jane Connors, thank you very much for a really interesting and open and engaged and engaging account of the work you do as victims' rights advocates. And now, on behalf of all the people who've been able to listen both through the Zoom format and through Facebook, that they found it really interesting, would like me to thank you on their behalf. I'd also like to thank them for participating, for the really interesting questions that have come from all sorts of different corners of the world. It's always wonderful to look at the array of people who participate in these events and to hear the thought-provoking questions that people put. So thank you very much for that. We are coming to the end of the Bonavero events for this academic year. We have one more, which is to mark the 10th anniversary of the Kenyan Constitution on the 28th of July. So you'll see that on our social media pages and also in our newsletters. But for the rest, if I could just once again thank Jane for a great presentation and wish you all to keep safe and during these very difficult times. Bye now.
Thank you to all. Ciao.